They flew in the dead of night. No headlights, no radios, no parachutes, just a flimsy wooden biplane, the kind most pilots would laugh at, until it came gliding silently above them like a ghost. A whisper in the dark, followed by the shriek of bombs falling from the sky. And here's the part that made the Nazis furious. These pilots were women, teenagers even. Many had never touched an airplane until months before the war. Yet they would become some of the most feared pilots in World War II, so deadly that German soldiers gave them a name dripping with both terror and respect.
Die Nachthexen.
Nachthexen, the night witches. But let's pause for a second. Imagine you're a German soldier in 1942. You've survived the brutal Russian winter. You're dug into a trench outside Stalingrad, exhausted, starving, praying for one night of sleep. Then, out of the black sky, you hear the faint whoosh of wind over canvas. No engine roar, no warning, just the sound of broomsticks sweeping the night air. Then the bombs drop. That's when you realize the truth. This is no ordinary air raid. How did a squadron of young Soviet women, flying outdated crop dusters with no armor, no guns and engines that could be killed by a single bullet, manage to terrify Hitler's war machine? Why did hardened German troops call them witches? And why did even being shot down not stop them from climbing back into the sky? This isn't just a war story. It's a story about defiance, ingenuity, and a weapon far more powerful than steel: the human will. And tonight, you're going to learn how a group of underdog pilots rewrote the rules of fear itself. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler launches the largest invasion in human history. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and a wave of aircraft meant to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. Cities burn. Villages vanish. Millions are killed or captured. The Soviet Red Army is reeling, desperate for reinforcements. Inside the Soviet Union, one voice rises with a plan that sounds almost impossible. Marina Raskova, the country's most famous female aviator. Known as the Russian Amelia Earhart, she had already become a national icon after setting long-distance flight records before the war. But now, she demanded something the Soviet High Command had never considered: an all-female combat unit. Think about that for a second. In 1941, most countries wouldn't even let women drive tanks, fire rifles, or touch fighter planes. But Raskova argued that women were not only capable, they were necessary. The Soviet Union was bleeding men at the front. Why waste half the population's talent when survival was on the line? Stalin agreed. And so, in October 1941, he signed an order creating the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, a unit entirely composed of women. Pilots, navigators, ground crew, mechanics, every role filled by female volunteers, many as young as 17. Some came straight from universities, others from farming villages, all driven by rage at the invaders who had burned their homes and killed their families. They would be trained quickly, brutally, and then thrown into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. Their weapon: a plane so laughably obsolete that even flight instructors winced. The Polikarpov Po-2 biplane, made of wood and canvas, with a maximum speed slower than a modern car. It was a training aircraft designed in the 1920s. It carried 2 bombs at most. There was no radio, no armor, no cockpit cover to keep out the freezing wind. If a bullet hit the gas tank, the plane erupted in flames. And yet, as we'll see, this flimsy wooden relic would become the perfect tool for terror in the night. But first, these women had to survive training, a process that would break many of them before they ever saw the front lines. The recruits arrived in droves. University students, farm girls, factory workers. Most had never seen a bomber up close. Many were barely old enough to vote. Some still wore school uniforms beneath their military coats. They expected shiny warplanes like the ones from propaganda posters. Instead, they were led to a hangar full of rickety wooden frames with fabric stretched across the wings. This is what you'll fly. The Po-2, a relic from another era, built for crop dusting fields and teaching flight cadets. Instructors joked it flew slower than a horse. Worse, it had an open cockpit. Imagine flying at 10,000 feet in the Russian winter. Temperatures plunging to -40. Your goggles freezing. Your hands turning numb on the controls. The cold wasn't just painful. It could kill you. The girls laughed nervously, but some felt a sting of betrayal. Was this Stalin's idea of equality? Throw them into the sky with toys while the men got sleek fighters like the Yak-9? But Marina Raskova, the woman who had fought for their right to be here, silenced their doubts. She reminded them the plane didn't matter. Their courage would be the weapon, and so the training began. They learned to take off and land on rough snow-covered fields in complete darkness. They practiced dropping bombs by hand because the planes had no proper bomb sights. They studied navigation with little more than compasses and star charts. A single mistake, misjudging wind, misreading a map, meant vanishing into the black forest below. And the training was merciless. Instructors shouted, cursed, forced them to repeat maneuvers until their muscles ached. Many broke down, some quit, but those who stayed grew sharper, hungrier. Still, the dangers were real. One cadet's plane caught fire during a night landing, killing her instantly. Another froze at the controls mid-air, her body pulled stiff by the cold until her navigator had to shove her aside to wrestle the plane down. Every lesson came with a price. But here's the irony. The very flaws of the Po-2, the slowness, the silence, the fragility, would later become their secret advantage. They just didn't know it yet. By spring of 1942, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment were ready, or at least as ready as anyone could be to face the Luftwaffe, the most powerful air force in the world. And so, their baptism of fire would come not in training fields but over the smoking ruins of Stalingrad. The women had trained in bitter cold and sleepless nights, but nothing compared to the first time they were told to climb into their planes and head toward the front. It was May 1942. The city was Stalingrad, already a nightmare of fire and rubble. German artillery pounded day and night. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. And into this chaos came the 588th, their wooden biplanes creaking like relics of another century. The order was simple: harass the enemy at night, drop bombs on supply depots, camps, fuel stations, force the Germans to lose sleep, wear them down night after night. Simple on paper, terrifying in practice. The pilots wore oversized men's uniforms, belts cinched, sleeves rolled, boots stuffed with rags to fit. Their planes carried 2 bombs each, no more. That meant 2 targets, or sometimes just 2 chances to get it right. And then the real test began. On their first run, the engines sputtered into the black sky. The girls flew in pairs, pilot and navigator, both barely visible against the moonlight. The cold hit instantly, slicing into their skin, freezing their breath against their scarves. One wrong move and the engine would stall. Then came the moment of silence. To avoid detection, the pilots cut their engines as they neared German lines. Suddenly, the roar was gone. Only the whisper of wind over fabric wings remained. They were gliding coffins now, silent predators descending out of the night. Below, German soldiers strained their ears. Some swore it sounded like broomsticks sweeping the sky. By the time they realized what it was, the bombs were already falling. The explosions tore through tents, trucks, fuel stores. Fires lit the camp. Men ran in panic, and by the time they looked up again, the night witches were gone, vanished into the dark like phantoms. When the pilots returned to base, their hands were frostbitten, their faces raw from the cold. But their eyes burned with something new, a fire of victory. They had proved it was possible, and the effect on the Germans? Immediate. Sleep became a luxury. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind at night sent shivers down their spines. The Nazis had tanks, machine guns, and Messerschmitts. The night witches had plywood, canvas, and courage. But, as one German officer later admitted, we could cope with anything, but not those witches at night. Still, these were only the first raids. Soon, the women would face a truth harsher than cold air or fragile planes. The Luftwaffe had noticed them, and they were not about to let the night witches fly unchallenged. The first raids rattled German camps, but they also drew attention. Word spread quickly through Luftwaffe command. A strange new squadron was attacking their positions. Not men, women. Flying machines so slow and fragile they seemed impossible to fight. At first, German pilots mocked the idea. What threat could a wooden crop duster pose to the Reich's steel-winged Messerschmitts? But mockery turned to obsession when reports came in. Fuel depots burning, ammunition dumps destroyed, men unable to sleep for weeks. So, the Luftwaffe set a trap. The next time the night witches flew over enemy lines, searchlights erupted from the ground. Beams cut across the sky, crisscrossing like blades of fire. Anti-aircraft guns barked into the night, tracers slicing toward the women's flimsy planes. Imagine the terror. No armor, no speed, no way to fight back. A single bullet could shred the canvas wings. A lucky burst would ignite the fuel tank. All the pilots could do was twist and dive, weaving through the beams like moths dodging a flame. And then came the hunters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the pride of the Luftwaffe, screamed into the night skies. Their engines roared like thunder. Their guns spat fire. Compared to them, the Po-2s looked like children's toys. But here's the twist. The Messerschmitts were too fast. Their engines stalled at the slow speeds the Po-2s crawled along. German aces cursed as they overshot, looped, and struggled to line up clean shots on targets moving slower than farm wagons. The night witches turned their weakness into a shield. Their planes skimmed treetops, hugged rivers, darted into darkness. Some Messerschmitt pilots gave up in frustration, calling the women devils in rags. Others doubled down, hunting them with a fury that would claim lives. Because while slowness could save them, it couldn't save everyone. On one mission, a young pilot named Yevdokia Nosal flew her plane into a storm of tracers. A burst ripped through the fuselage, killing her instantly. Her navigator, splattered with blood, managed to grab the controls and somehow land the plane on Soviet soil. Yevdokia became the regiment's first posthumous hero of the Soviet Union. The losses cut deep. These weren't nameless soldiers. They were sisters, daughters, classmates. The women grieved together, then climbed back into their planes. For them, retreat was not an option. The front was too close, the stakes too high, and something remarkable happened. Each death seemed only to sharpen their resolve. Instead of breaking the unit, the Luftwaffe's fire forged them harder. German intelligence began to whisper a chilling rumor. These witches would never stop. But endurance came at a cost. The missions grew longer, the nights colder, the bodies more exhausted. To keep flying, they had to invent tactics no one had ever used before, and those tactics would turn them into legends. By the summer of 1942, the 588th Regiment had flown enough missions to learn a brutal truth. Flying wooden biplanes against the Luftwaffe was suicide, unless they learned to turn weakness into strategy. And so, the women began to experiment. They discovered their planes could take off from fields so small and rough that no German fighter dared risk landing there. They learned to fly so low that their Po-2s seemed to skim the treetops, slipping under radar and weaving past searchlights. But their most terrifying trick was silence. As they neared German camps, the pilots would cut their engines. The propellers slowed to a whisper. The wooden wings groaned softly in the night air. For the soldiers below, the sound was unmistakable, like broomsticks sweeping across the sky. That eerie, ghostly whoosh became their signature. Then, just as the Germans strained to listen, bombs fell. Fuel tanks erupted. Ammunition dumps lit the night like fireworks. Tents collapsed in flames. By the time soldiers scrambled for their guns, the witches had already vanished, restarting their engines only once they were safely back in the dark. But one trick wasn't enough. To survive, they needed coordination. They developed a tactic that the Germans would later call the three-plane attack. The first plane would swoop in, deliberately drawing the attention of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. The second plane followed close behind, bomb bay doors open, waiting for the moment when the guns locked onto the first decoy. The third plane slipped in silently through the blind spot, cutting its engine at the last second and releasing its bombs with devastating accuracy. The pilots rotated roles each mission. No one was safe, no one was spared. The decoy plane was always a death sentence waiting to happen, and yet they volunteered. Night after night they played this deadly game, knowing that one day the searchlights would lock on too fast. The results were undeniable. German supply depots ran low. Soldiers were restless, paranoid, unwilling to sleep. Some officers refused to light cigarettes after dark, terrified that the faint glow would attract a witch's bomb. The women kept coming. 10, 15, sometimes 18 sorties a night. Take off, bomb, land, reload, repeat until dawn. Exhaustion chewed at their bones. Frostbite blackened their fingers, yet they refused to stop. Still, the price grew heavier. Planes riddled with bullet holes limped back on one wing. Friends failed to return. Navigators were pulled from burning wrecks, their faces scarred forever. And yet, by the end of 1942, the regiment had flown over 1,000 missions. The Germans no longer laughed at the idea of girls in biplanes. They cursed them. They feared them. They named them Die Nachthexen, the night witches. But fear is a double-edged sword. For the witches themselves, each night carried the same haunting question. When will my luck run out? When dawn finally broke over the airfields, the witches returned not as heroes but as wrecks of flesh and bone. Picture this. A young woman, 19 years old, crawling out of her cockpit after her 10th sortie of the night. Her cheeks are frostbitten, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes sunken from exhaustion. She has no strength left to walk, so ground crew members carry her from the plane like a wounded child. This was routine. Between raids, there was no rest. Their barracks were little more than drafty huts or barns, sometimes just tents pitched in the mud. They had no heat, no hot water, no privacy. Their uniforms were hand-me-downs from dead male soldiers, boots several sizes too big, trousers cinched with rope, jackets that smelled of sweat and gunpowder. They stuffed rags into their boots to stop frostbite. They tore strips from parachutes to sew into makeshift underwear because the army didn't bother supplying them. They cut their hair short, not for style but to keep lice from spreading, and yet in these miserable moments they found each other. Laughter echoed between missions. They braided each other's hair, wrote poems, sang songs under the stars. One girl carried a violin with her through the war and played after raids, filling the cold night with music that softened even the hardest hearts. They joked, too. They nicknamed their planes sewing machines because of the sputtering sound of the engines. They painted flowers on the fuselages, scrawled names like Katyusha or Fearless Nina on the sides. To the outside world, they were witches. To each other, they were sisters. But grief was always near. When a plane failed to return, silence fell. They didn't cry immediately. First came the ritual. Write the report, note the time, the place, the last radio call, if there was one. Then came the waiting. Sometimes a lost crew stumbled back days later, frostbitten but alive. Other times, only wreckage was found. And here's the cruel part. There was no time to mourn. The war didn't pause for funerals. The regiment would fly again that very night, empty bunks serving as reminders of who was missing. One pilot scribbled in her diary, "We fly with ghosts now. They sit behind us, whispering in the wind." Yet somehow this grief hardened them. Each loss was fuel. Each night, raid became a vow of revenge. The Germans thought fatigue and fear would break the witches. Instead, it bound them tighter. But war has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. And soon, the night witches would face challenges that would push them past human limits. Missions so dangerous that survival seemed impossible. By late 1942, the Soviet command had seen enough to know the night witches were not a novelty. They were a weapon, and weapons get used until they break. The orders grew harsher. Targets grew deadlier. No longer just supply depots on the edges of the front. Now the witches were sent against heavily defended German strongholds. Fortified positions crawling with searchlights, anti-aircraft batteries, and radar posts waiting for the faint hum of their engines. Every mission was a gamble. Picture it: 3 women in 3 planes circling above a blackened city. Searchlights cut the night, beams sweeping like blades. Tracers stitched the sky, red and green lines climbing upward. The women could see it all, the flak bursts exploding like black flowers just ahead of their wings. And still, they pressed forward. This was not bravery in the way we usually imagine it. It was endurance. It was stubbornness. It was the refusal to let fear paralyze the hands that held the stick. And sometimes, even stubbornness wasn't enough. On one raid, a navigator leaned out of her cockpit to release a bomb by hand, only to have the blast throw her plane into a spin. The pilot fought the controls, wood creaking, wings shuddering, the earth rushing closer. At the last second, she leveled out, skimming the treetops. When they landed, her hands were frozen to the stick and had to be pried loose. Another crew wasn't so lucky. Caught in searchlights, they became a glowing target. Flak shredded their plane, tearing canvas and splintering wood. The wreck crashed in flames. In the morning, comrades found only twisted metal and the charred outline of 2 women who had given their lives in silence. And yet, each loss only sharpened the regiment's resolve. They flew with fury. Some nights they flew 18 sorties back-to-back, take off, bomb, land, refuel, repeat until dawn broke. Imagine that rhythm. Up, down, like the beating of wings in the dark. Trance-like. Relentless, the Germans began to crack. Officers wrote reports of soldiers refusing to sleep, their nerves shredded by the thought of another midnight visit. They knew the witches could come at any hour. They knew the silence meant death. But here's the question that haunted every German camp. How much longer can these women last? The answer was darker than anyone expected. Because soon, the witches would not just strike fear, they would become legends whispered even by their enemies. At first, the Germans dismissed them. Wooden biplanes flown by girls, what threat could they pose? But by the winter of 1942, the dismissals had turned to curses, and the curses became whispers. Soldiers began calling them Nachthexen, the night witches. The name wasn't given lightly. To German infantry shivering in trenches, the sound of those gliding planes was uncanny, almost supernatural. No roaring engines, no warning. Just the faint whoosh of canvas wings cutting through the dark. It sounded like broomsticks in flight. And then, seconds later, the thunder of bombs. That name stuck. And it spread faster than bullets. Captured German prisoners muttered about witches who could not be killed. Some swore they flew with magic, appearing from nowhere, vanishing into black skies no radar could detect. Others claimed the Soviets had trained owls or ghosts to drop bombs at night. Fear does strange things to tired men. But here's the surprise. The nickname, born out of terror, became a badge of honor. The Soviet women embraced it. They painted broomsticks on their planes. They laughed about the title during brief moments of rest. If the enemy thought they were witches, then witches they would be. And the proof of their effectiveness was impossible to deny. By early 1943, the Night Witches had flown thousands of missions, dropping over 3,000 tons of bombs. Entire supply lines were crippled, ammunition convoys destroyed, fuel depots lit the night sky in flames. Even German commanders, men who sneered at the idea of women in combat, admitted grudging respect. One Luftwaffe officer famously complained, "These women pilots are like devils. You give us guns and searchlights and still they come." The legend grew larger than life. Soviet propaganda broadcast their stories across the homeland. Girls in villages whispered their names like heroes from folklore. Families torn apart by war took pride in knowing women were striking back. And yet, behind the myth, the witches themselves were still human. They still stitched patches into torn uniforms, still stuffed rags in their boots, still wept silently when a bunk was left empty. But the Germans didn't see that. To them, every shadow, every whisper, every sleepless night carried the same dread. Are the witches coming tonight? The fear was real, but so was the cost, because myths don't live without sacrifice. And soon, the night witches would pay in blood to keep their legend alive. By 1943, the legend of the night witches was spreading across the front. But legends are built on sacrifice, and every victory carved a scar into the regiment's heart. The women lived with a cruel truth. Every mission could be their last. Planes came back riddled with holes, fabric flapping like torn skin. Engines sputtered, coughing their last breaths as they limped onto the runway. Sometimes a plane landed with one wheel gone, skidding sideways through mud and snow, throwing sparks into the night, and sometimes they didn't land at all. One night, two friends, closer than sisters, took off together. Their planes disappeared into the black sky. Hours passed. No word, no sign. When dawn came, only a column of smoke on the horizon hinted at their fate. The wreckage was later found charred. Nothing left but fragments of wood and ash. The regiment buried what little they could find in a shallow grave near the forest. Another time, a navigator was shot mid-flight. She slumped forward, blood freezing against her coat. Her pilot flew the rest of the mission with her friend's body beside her, refusing to abandon the raid. When she returned, she staggered out of the cockpit and collapsed, sobbing into her blood-stained gloves. Loss was constant. They kept count in silence. Empty beds in the barracks, letters returned unopened. Uniforms folded and set aside, waiting for no one. And yet, despite the grief, despite the fear, the regiment never broke. Each loss seemed only to harden their resolve. They flew with ghosts at their backs, whispering reminders of why they fought, for their homes, their families, their fallen sisters. One pilot wrote in her journal, "We are not afraid to die. We are afraid only of failing." But here's the twist. The more they lost, the more dangerous they became. Anger sharpened their courage. Their raids grew bolder, their tactics more daring. The Germans thought exhaustion and death would end the witches. Instead, it only fueled them. Still, a question hung in the air. How long could any human endure this? The answer would come with their next chapter, one of their most relentless campaigns of the entire war. Stalingrad, a city turned into a graveyard. Buildings reduced to skeletons of brick. Streets littered with rubble and frozen corpses. The Volga River, once a lifeline, now ran red with blood. It was here, in late 1942 and early 1943, that the night witches were thrown into the crucible. Their mission: break the German lines, disrupt supplies, and keep pressure on the Wehrmacht soldiers locked in the tightening Soviet noose. But flying over Stalingrad was unlike any mission before. The city never slept. Day and night, flames licked the sky, smoke choked the air, and the crack of rifles echoed like a heartbeat. Anti-aircraft guns were everywhere, hidden in the ruins, mounted on rooftops scattered across the frozen fields. The sky above the city was a cage of fire, and still, the witches flew. Night after night, they soared above the burning ruins, cutting engines, gliding silently, dropping bombs into ammunition depots and German command posts. They learned to time their attacks so explosions merged with the thunder of artillery, masking their presence until it was too late. The Germans fought back with fury. Spotlights clawed at the clouds. Machine guns spat into the dark. Sometimes the women returned to base with wings shredded, fuselages peppered with holes, engines coughing smoke. Sometimes they didn't return at all. But here's the part the Germans never understood. The night witches weren't just bombing buildings. They were bombing morale. Imagine being a German soldier at Stalingrad, trapped, hungry, surrounded by Soviet forces. And just when you close your eyes at night, exhausted, you hear that sound again, that eerie whoosh of broomsticks sweeping across the sky. Then the ground shakes, fire erupts, sleep is shattered. Over weeks, the raids became psychological warfare. Men spoke of witches who could see in the dark, witches who hunted their dreams, witches who turned the night itself into a weapon. And the impact was real. By the time the German Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, Tens of thousands of soldiers were broken not just by starvation and cold, but by the knowledge that they had been stalked from the skies by young women in wooden planes. For the Night Witches, Stalingrad was proof of something they already knew. Weakness could be turned into strength, and fear could be sharpened into a blade. But the war was far from over. Beyond Stalingrad lay new battles, new missions, and new horrors that would push them even further. Because the witches were no longer just soldiers, they were a symbol, and symbols cannot be allowed to fall. With Stalingrad behind them, the Red Army surged west, driving the Germans out of the ruins and into retreat. But the war didn't grow easier. It grew harder. Every kilometer gained meant new fronts, new missions, new nights of terror for the 588th. The Night Witches were no longer the underdogs no one believed in. They were now veterans, trusted with some of the most dangerous assignments of the war. And the Germans were adapting. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had learned that the witches weren't to be underestimated. They set up more searchlights, positioned flak guns closer to key supply points, and stationed night fighters specifically to hunt the Po-2s. The sky grew thicker with danger, but the women adapted too. They developed tricks that defied logic. They flew so low their planes kicked dust off the ground. They hugged rivers to mask their approach. Sometimes they cut engines miles before the target, gliding silently for minutes in the dark, holding their breath until it was time to release the bombs. They became shadows, slipping through gaps no radar could follow. Still, even shadows could bleed. On one mission, a formation of night witches approached a German supply depot. As the lead plane cut its engine, a Messerschmitt dove from above, machine guns blazing. The fragile biplane exploded instantly. Burning fabric spiraled through the night like a torch. But instead of fleeing, the other two crews pressed forward. They dropped their bombs on target, igniting the depot in a chain of fiery blasts that lit the night sky. Only then did they turn back, tears freezing on their cheeks as they flew past the wreckage of their fallen sisters. This was the paradox of the Night Witches. Every success carried the shadow of loss. Victory and grief became inseparable, yet their legend only grew stronger. Soviet commanders began pointing to the regiment as proof of resilience. Newspapers praised their daring. Even their enemies wrote reports about the infernal women who haunt our nights. But for the women themselves, the war was no myth. It was hunger gnawing at their stomachs, frost cracking their skin, grief gnawing at their hearts. And in the middle of this relentless grind, something began to change inside them. The witches were no longer simply flying for survival. They were flying for revenge, for justice, for each other. And that hunger would soon drive them into some of the boldest missions of their lives, missions that bordered on the impossible. By 1943, the Night Witches were no longer just participants in the war. They had become its sharpened edge. Soviet command leaned on them heavily, demanding missions so exhausting that even hardened male pilots shook their heads in disbelief. And yet, the witches kept flying. One night, orders came down, harassed the German lines without pause. The regiment split into groups. Each crew would take off, bomb, land, reload, and take off again until their arms ached from lifting bombs and their eyes stung too much to see. Up, down, up, down. It became a rhythm, a trance of terror, each sortie a heartbeat, each landing just another breath before the next leap into the dark. By dawn, some women had flown 18 missions in a single night, 18 times through the gauntlet of searchlights and flak, 18 times trusting canvas wings to keep them alive, 18 times facing death and choosing to rise again. Their commanders were stunned. No one thought it was humanly possible. And yet, they had done it. But the feats didn't end there. On another mission, one pilot's plane was riddled with bullets. Her fuel tank leaked, the engine coughed black smoke, but she refused to turn back. She kept flying toward the target, her navigator shouting directions over the freezing wind. Together, they released their bombs, hit their mark, and barely coasted back to Soviet lines before the engine died. When they landed, the plane collapsed on the runway, held together by nothing but willpower. Stories like these spread quickly. Soldiers on the front whispered about the witches who flew until their planes disintegrated under them. German prisoners spoke of biplanes that seemed unkillable, pilots who flew with fire in their veins. The women weren't trying to be legendary. They were simply surviving. But in surviving, they became more than human. Still, endurance has a price. Each impossible mission chipped away at their bodies. Hands shook from frostbite. Lungs burned from the constant cold. Some women could no longer feel their fingers. Others lost their hearing from the constant roar of engines. And yet they flew, because beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, lay the one thing they refused to surrender: the sky. But war doesn't stop at exhaustion. It keeps escalating. And soon, the Night Witches would face their most dangerous challenge yet: an enemy specifically designed to hunt them down. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was tired of humiliation. The witches had burned their depots, shredded their supply lines, and robbed their soldiers of sleep. Wooden planes, yes, but wooden planes that refused to die. So, the Germans unleashed hunters. Specially trained night fighter squadrons armed with Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Fast, deadly, bristling with machine guns. These weren't patrols. These were executions waiting to happen. For the women, the change was immediate. One night, a crew cut their engines, gliding silently toward a target. Then, out of the blackness came a roar like thunder. A German fighter screamed past, its guns flashing. Tracers ripped the sky, bullets tearing through canvas. The witches twisted, dove, prayed the darkness would hide them. Somehow, they slipped away, but many wouldn't be so lucky. The Messerschmitts had a clear advantage: speed, power, fire. The Po-2s had nothing but silence and shadows. And yet, silence and shadows proved enough. The Germans quickly discovered a maddening flaw. Their fighters were too fast. To line up a shot on the witches, they had to slow down so much their engines threatened to stall. Skilled aces, used to dueling Spitfires and Yaks, suddenly found themselves overshooting, their cannons emptying into empty night air. The witches exploited this. They flew low, hugging the treetops, darting through valleys and rivers. They split apart suddenly, forcing German fighters to choose between them. Some even skimmed so close to the ground their wingtips clipped branches. Better to risk the earth than face a Messerschmitt head-on. Still, the danger was relentless. One young pilot, her plane riddled with holes, made a desperate choice. She ordered her navigator to jump, then banked sharply into a dive, straight at the German fighter pursuing them. The two planes collided in a fireball that lit the night sky. Both crews perished, but the sacrifice allowed the rest of the regiment to finish their mission. Acts like this carved the witches deeper into legend. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were hunters themselves, women who turned fragility into a weapon. And the Germans knew it. Reports circulated through their ranks warning, these witches cannot be underestimated. They appear when least expected. They vanish when pursued. They kill without mercy. But here's the cruel truth. Even witches bleed. Each German counterattack meant more names scratched off the roster, more empty beds in the barracks. The regiment was thinning, and yet their orders kept coming. Because now the Soviets were pushing west, toward Kursk, and Kursk would be hell on earth. July 1943. Kursk. The largest tank battle in human history was about to begin. On one side, nearly 3,000 German tanks, the steel fists of the Wehrmacht. Panthers, Tigers, armored divisions rolling like a tidal wave of fire and iron. On the other, the Soviet Red Army, dug in across fields, forests, and villages, waiting for the blow. The air itself seemed to tremble. Artillery thundered day and night. The ground shook with the grinding treads of tanks, and the skies were thick with smoke. Kursk was not a battlefield. It was a furnace. And into this furnace, the Night Witches were sent. Their mission was clear: crippled the German offensive by striking supply lines, fuel depots, and tank concentrations under cover of night. The Soviets knew the Germans couldn't be stopped head-on, but if the witches could cut the lifelines, starve the beasts of fuel and ammunition, the tide could shift. Easier said than done. Flying over Kursk was like diving into hell. Searchlights stabbed the sky in every direction. Flak bursts filled the night with fire, and German fighters prowled like wolves. Each mission was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. But the witches flew anyway. They cut engines and glided silently over columns of tanks hidden in the fields. Then came the bombs. Small compared to what heavy bombers dropped, but devastating when they struck fuel trucks or ammunition carriers. Explosions rippled through the German lines. Tank crews woke in panic as flames engulfed the night, their steel monsters stranded without fuel. Night after night, sortie after sortie, the witches chipped away at the German advance. The rhythm was brutal. Take off, bomb, land, reload. No rest, no sleep, just the endless cycle of rising into darkness and returning with the taste of smoke in their mouths. And the Germans. Their frustration boiled over. Captured soldiers spoke of being unable to sleep, their nerves fraying. One officer admitted, "Every time we closed our eyes, we feared the witches would come." But Kursk was merciless for both sides. Several crews never returned, their planes swallowed by the furnace of battle. Sometimes only burning fragments marked where they fell. Sometimes they vanished entirely into the black earth of Russia, never to be found. Yet the regiment endured. They flew with ghosts, with grief, with rage. And as the days dragged into weeks, the Soviet defense stiffened. The German advance slowed, then faltered. By the end of July, Kursk was no longer a German offensive. It was a Soviet victory. The largest tank battle in history had ended, and the Night Witches had played their part, proving again that courage could turn the tide of war. But Kursk was only a turning point, not the end. The Red Army was pushing west, and the witches would follow, into Belarus, Poland, and beyond. And with each mile gained, their legend grew darker, sharper, and deadlier. After Kursk, the war shifted. The Soviets were no longer just defending. They were advancing. Mile by mile, town by town, the Red Army clawed back land that had been under German boots for 2 years. And the Night Witches were with them. Their missions now stretched farther west, Belarus, Ukraine, and soon into Poland. Each new front meant new challenges. The airstrips were crude, little more than cleared fields dotted with mud and snow. Sometimes they had to fly from swamps or forests, hiding their planes under camouflage nets to avoid German reconnaissance. The conditions were miserable. Supplies were scarce, food was rationed, and the wooden planes wore out faster with every mission. Mechanics, also women, worked through freezing nights to patch torn wings with scraps of canvas and nail-cracked struts back into place. Some planes had so many bullet holes they looked like lace, but the witches kept flying. Everywhere the Germans retreated, they left destruction behind. Burned villages, shattered bridges, fields of corpses. For many of the pilots, these were not just battlegrounds but home. They flew over towns where their families had once lived, now reduced to ash. For some, the war was no longer about duty. It was personal revenge, and revenge gave them fuel no engine could. The Germans, desperate to slow the Soviet advance, dug in with fortified strongholds. Each stronghold needed supplies that the Night Witches were sent to destroy. Night after night, the witches hunted convoys. They learned to follow faint tracks in the snow, the glimmer of headlights beneath blackout covers, the smell of burning oil on the wind. Their bombs found fuel trucks, artillery positions, and command posts. The Germans cursed them. Soviet soldiers cheered them, and slowly the balance of power in the east shifted. But pushing west came with a new kind of danger. The further they advanced, the closer they flew to German heartlands. Anti-aircraft defenses grew denser, patrols sharper, and the nights less forgiving. The witches had become predators, but now they were flying straight into the jaws of the beast. and in those jaws, some of their most daring and dangerous missions awaited. By late 1943, the Red Army's advance pressed into Belarus, a land of dense forests, rivers, and swamps that became killing grounds for both sides. The Germans fortified every crossing, every town, every stretch of railway, and once again the witches were called in. Their orders: disrupt everything. Burn the bridges, cripple the rail lines, shatter the German ability to move tanks and supplies. If the Wehrmacht couldn't move, it couldn't fight, but Belarus was a death trap in the sky. The Germans had learned. They set up thick rings of flak batteries around rail junctions, camouflaged in the woods. They trained searchlights to sweep the sky with precision, catching even the faintest shadow of canvas wings. They even stationed night fighters above suspected bombing routes, circling like vultures waiting for prey, and yet the witches adapted. They flew lower than ever before, sometimes so low that branches slapped against their wings. They hugged rivers, skimming just feet above the water to evade radar and flak. One pilot joked bitterly, "If I flew any lower, I'd need a boat, not a plane." Sometimes they took risks so bold they seemed impossible. On one mission, a pair of witches deliberately drew searchlights to themselves, banking wildly, dodging fire, while a third crew slipped through the darkness to drop bombs directly on the German position. When the decoys returned, their planes were riddled with holes, but both pilots were alive. Their courage had saved the mission. Another time, a plane took a direct hit. Canvas ripped away, fuel leaking, the engine coughing smoke. The navigator, instead of panicking, climbed onto the wing mid-flight with her bare hands and stuffed fabric into the holes to keep the wing from tearing apart. Against all odds, they made it back to base. Stories like these spread through the regiment like fire. Each act of survival reminded them. Death was always a breath away, but so was victory. The Germans were furious. They began offering rewards to any pilot who could shoot down a witch. Some claimed that downing even one earned the Iron Cross. Whether the bounty was real or rumor didn't matter. It only added to the aura of fear. But here's the bitter truth. The more legendary they became, the more dangerous every night grew. Belarus was just one step west. Beyond it lay Poland, and then Germany itself. And with each step, the question grew louder. How long could the witches fly before their wings were finally broken? By 1944, the Red Army's march west had reached Poland. For the Night Witches, this was a new kind of battlefield. Cities still under German occupation, partisan fighters hiding in the forests, civilians caught between retreating Nazis and advancing Soviets. Their orders were clear: bleed the German war machine dry, bomb supply depots, destroy bridges, harass every retreating convoy until there was nowhere left for them to run. But Poland was no easier than Belarus. The Germans were desperate now, and desperation made them ruthless. They lined the railroads with flak cannons. They stationed night fighters above the Vistula River. They rigged towns with explosives so the advancing Soviets would inherit only rubble. Every mission the witches flew meant threading through a labyrinth of fire and steel. And yet, they pressed on. One crew dropped bombs on a German convoy carrying ammunition. The explosions rippled down the line, setting off a chain reaction that lit the night sky for miles. Another crew targeted a bridge vital for German reinforcements. They missed on the first pass, but instead of retreating, they circled back through withering fire, releasing their last bombs and collapsing the span into the river. The cost was brutal. Planes returned shredded, engines sputtering. Navigators crawled from cockpits bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Sometimes crews didn't return at all. The regiment kept a grim ritual. When a plane failed to come back, they left the bed untouched, the blanket folded, the pillow undisturbed, as if waiting for ghosts. And yet, amidst this cruelty, there were moments of humanity. After missions, the women huddled together in barns or huts, sharing the last scraps of bread, warming their hands around tiny stoves. They laughed when they could, teased each other, swapped stories of childhoods that felt like another lifetime. Some fell in love with fellow soldiers, scribbling letters by candlelight that they knew might never be read. They carried grief like extra weight, but they also carried each other. and slowly their raids began to tip the balance. German retreat routes through Poland grew chaotic, supply lines shredded, morale cracking. Soldiers whispered that the witches followed them wherever they went, relentless, merciless. But the deeper the Red Army pushed into Poland, the closer the witches came to their enemy's heartland. And with each mile west, the missions grew deadlier, because beyond Poland lay the gates of Germany itself. And the question lingered. When the witches reached the Reich, could even their courage be enough? By late 1944, the Red Army had swept through Poland. For the first time, the Night Witches faced missions not just over occupied lands but into the Reich itself. Crossing into Germany meant stepping into the lion's den. The Luftwaffe had fortified the skies. Searchlights lit entire grids of airspace. Anti-aircraft guns ringed every city, every depot, every bridge. Radar stations tracked movement across miles. Even the civilians were warned to watch the skies, to report the faintest sound of engines in the night. For most pilots, these defenses would have been suicide. For the Night Witches, they were simply another night's work. They slipped across borders silently, gliding low over forests and rivers, cutting engines miles before their targets. They attacked fuel depots, supply trains, even airfields where German fighters slept. But survival was harder here than ever. One crew approached a munitions plant deep inside German territory. The searchlights snapped on instantly, converging like claws. Flak exploded all around them, shards of metal punching holes through the canvas wings. The pilot fought the controls, her navigator leaning out to drop their bombs by hand. They hit the plant, setting off a blast that lit the night like day. But their plane never made it home. When comrades searched later, all they found was smoke curling from a crater, and yet even these losses only seemed to harden the regiment. For every plane shot down, 3 more took off. For every pilot lost, the rest flew harder, angrier, deadlier. German reports spoke of a squadron that does not sleep, does not die, does not break. By now, the women were legends even in their own army. Soviet soldiers on the ground would look up at night, see the faint silhouettes passing silently overhead, and whisper, "The witches are flying tonight." Their presence alone was enough to lift morale. Still, legends are not invincible. The closer they flew to Berlin, the denser the fire became. Losses mounted. The war was clearly entering its final act, but for the Night Witches, the final act promised to be the bloodiest. Because if the Reich was crumbling, it would not go quietly. And in those collapsing nights of 1945, the witches would fly some of their most daring, desperate missions of the entire war. The winter of 1944 to 45 was the war's cruelest season. Germany was collapsing, yes, but the collapse was violent, dragging everything down with it. The Wehrmacht fought with the desperation of men who knew their world was ending. For the Night Witches, it was the hardest test of all. Snow buried their airstrips, turning runways into frozen swamps. Mechanics shoveled through nights just to clear space for takeoffs. Frostbite gnawed at fingers already scarred from years of cold. Fuel was scarce. Rations were thinner than ever. Some women flew on empty stomachs, bones aching with hunger, and still, they flew. Up, down, through snowstorms that blinded their eyes. Through nights where the temperature dropped so low their breath froze into crystals on their scarves. Through skies so thick with fire that the heavens themselves seemed to be burning. They attacked rail lines carrying retreating German divisions. They bombed bridges the enemy was trying to use to escape west. They struck fuel depots meant to keep the last tanks alive. Every sortie chipped away at what remained of Hitler's armies. But the cost was merciless. Planes crashed into frozen rivers when engines stalled mid-air. Navigators froze in open cockpits, their bodies stiff before the mission was done. Pilots returned to base with their faces blackened from smoke, their voices cracked from screaming over the roar of flak. One night, a crew returned with half their plane shredded. Holes gaped in the wings, struts bent, canvas torn. They landed with the fuselage held together by wires and luck. When they climbed out, the ground crew could hardly believe the plane had flown at all. Another night, 2 planes went out and never returned. Their sisters left the beds untouched, boots by the door, as if waiting for ghosts that would never walk in again. And yet, amidst the cold, the hunger, the grief, they kept going, because by now, the witches weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting for closure, to see the end, to prove that every loss, every night, every scar had been worth something. And as 1945 began, the end finally came into view. The Red Army surged toward Berlin. The Reich was on its knees, but for the Night Witches, the last missions would be the most dangerous of all, because legends aren't remembered for how they start. They're remembered for how they end. Spring 1945, Germany was falling apart. The Red Army thundered toward Berlin, its artillery shaking the earth, its tanks grinding west. For the Night Witches, this was the final stretch, the end they had been flying toward through 4 years of night. But the end was no gentle landing. The Germans fought with the rage of the doomed. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed every stronghold. Searchlights swept the skies with surgical precision. The Luftwaffe, though broken, still sent up night fighters to hunt the women who had haunted them for years. And yet, the witches kept flying. One night, they launched from a muddy strip outside Poland, engines sputtering, wings patched with canvas and nails. Their target, a German fuel dump supporting the last defenders near the Oder River. They cut engines, glided in silence, and dropped their bombs. The explosions lit the night sky like lightning, fire rolling across the riverbanks. It was one of their last major strikes, but even in these final missions, losses came. A young pilot, barely 20, was hit over Germany's forests. Her plane caught fire, flames devouring the wings. Instead of bailing out, she held the controls steady, guiding her plane into the fuel depot below. The explosion tore through the night. She never returned, but her name became etched into the regiment's story as one of its fiercest heroines. The rest flew on, night after night, until April 1945, the Night Witches rained fire on a collapsing Reich. Their last missions were as relentless as their first. Short flights, fast turns, endless reloading. By the time the guns fell silent, they had flown over 30,000 sorties and dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs. When Berlin finally fell in May, the witches gathered in silence. No cheers, no parades, just exhaustion, relief, and the weight of ghosts. They had begun as girls mocked for flying wooden relics. They ended as one of the most decorated regiments in the Soviet Air Force. 23 of them were named heroes of the Soviet Union. Many more carried scars, on their bodies, in their hearts, that no metal could mend. And the Germans. They never forgot. To their enemies, they would always be the witches of the night, women who turned fragile wings and fragile bodies into instruments of terror. But to history, they remain something larger, proof that courage can fly higher than fear, even on wings made of wood and canvas.